The fire didn't start in the trees. It started with one signature, and by sunrise, everything Dorilla had spent 40 years building for his family belonged to someone else. He wasn't robbed by strangers in the dark. He was surrounded by smiling faces he trusted, the kind of faces every retiree believes would never betray them. The heartbreaking part wasn't that Dorilla made one terrible mistake. It was that the warning signs had been there for months, hidden behind kindness, family conversations, and promises that sounded completely reasonable. By the end of this story, you'll understand why inheritance fraud rarely begins after someone dies. It often begins while they're still alive. Morning sunlight filtered through towering trees as birds welcomed another quiet day. Dorilla the gorilla stepped onto his porch with a steaming cup of herbal tea. He smiled. For the first time in decades, there was nowhere he needed to rush. No factory whistle, no overtime. No aching shoulders from carrying lumber through endless winters. His retirement wasn't extravagant, but it was enough. Enough to eat, enough to keep his cabin warm, enough to help the grandchildren someday. Across the clearing stood an old oak tree. Every autumn, Dorilla carved another small mark into its trunk. One mark for every year he worked. 42 marks. 42 years of early mornings, missed birthdays, sacrificed vacations, careful saving. Every mark represented another season he chose responsibility over comfort. He rested one large hand against the bark.
This tree,
He whispered.
is my family's future.
Unknown to Dorilla, someone else had already begun measuring that future. High on another hill, hidden behind thick leaves, golden eyes watched him. Kitsune the fox quietly closed the leather notebook. Inside were names, properties, savings, ages, and one new note. Dorilla, retired, owns cabin, no debt, family nearby, lives alone. Kitsune smiled. Some predators hunted prey, others hunted paperwork. The breeze carried away a single page from his notebook. It drifted toward the forest path, landing at someone else's feet. Kamei the turtle slowly picked it up. His eyes narrowed. He didn't recognize the handwriting, but he recognized danger. A few days later, the forest was alive with laughter. Dorilla's family had gathered for a summer picnic. Children chased butterflies. Music echoed through the trees. Fresh berries covered every table. Saru the monkey arrived carrying gifts. He hugged everyone. He laughed louder than anyone else. He insisted on washing dishes before anyone could ask.
Family should always help family,
He said with a grin. Dorilla smiled proudly.
Saru has a good heart.
Not far away, Kitsune watched from beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He never introduced himself. He simply observed. Who spoke the most? Who interrupted? Who controlled conversations? Who handled paperwork? When everyone relaxed, Kitsune quietly approached Saru.
You must care deeply about your uncle.
Saru nodded proudly.
of course.
Kitsune lowered his voice.
Then you should know. Families lose fortunes every day because no one plans ahead.
Saru frowned.
What do you mean?
I've seen estates disappear, taxes, legal confusion, arguments, years of court battles. But people who prepare,
He smiled.
protect everything.
The words lingered in Saru's mind long after Kitsune walked away. That evening, Saru casually asked Dorilla.
Uncle, have you ever updated your paperwork?
Dorilla laughed.
There's plenty of time.
From across the yard, Kame overheard the conversation. His smile faded. Sometimes, the most dangerous storms begin with ordinary questions. Weeks passed. The question kept returning. Paperwork, planning, protecting the family. Saru brought it up during dinner, during fishing trips, while repairing fences. Never forcefully, always gently, almost lovingly. One afternoon, Kitsune finally introduced himself. He arrived wearing an expensive suit, carrying polished folders, speaking softly, never rushing.
My work
Kitsune explained.
Is helping families avoid unnecessary hardship.
He never said he was an attorney. He never claimed to be a financial advisor. He simply allowed everyone else to make assumptions. He complimented Darilla's work ethic, praised his careful saving, admired his modest lifestyle. Predators often begin with admiration because admiration lowers defenses. Darilla felt respected, seen, understood. Kitsune placed several papers on the table. No decisions today.
I only want to educate you.
That sentence made everyone relax. For nearly 2 hours, they talked about protecting family harmony, avoiding future conflict, leaving a legacy instead of confusion. Everything sounded reasonable. Everything sounded responsible. Everything sounded like love. As Kitsune packed his briefcase, he quietly left behind one folder. Across the top, large letters read, "Protect your family before it's too late." Darilla stared at the cover long after everyone had gone home. The changes were almost invisible. Saru suddenly became very interested in Darilla's documents, insurance papers, property records, old family letters. He called more often, visited more frequently, asked questions he had never asked before.
Where do you keep your important papers? Who has your house key? Did Grandpa ever write a will?
Each question sounded harmless. Together, they formed a pattern. Kamei noticed. During one evening walk, he sat beside Darilla near the old oak tree.
Have you ever noticed,
Kamei asked.
that termites don't knock down a tree overnight?
Darilla chuckled.
They eat it slowly.
Kamei nodded.
So do dishonest people.
Darilla laughed.
Saru would never hurt me.
I'm not worried about Saru.
Kamei looked toward the distant forest.
I'm worried about people who benefit from trust.
Darilla dismissed the concern. After all, Kitsune had been polite, professional, helpful, and Saru was family. That night, Darilla locked his cabin, but he left the folder from Kitsune sitting on the kitchen table, waiting, almost inviting the next step. Outside, 2 glowing eyes watched the cabin lights go dark. Autumn arrived. The leaves turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Darilla invited Saru and Kitsune inside for coffee. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The atmosphere felt warm, comfortable, safe. Kitsune spread several documents across the table.
These are simply planning papers, eh?
He said calmly.
They help organize your wishes.
Darilla skimmed the pages. They were long, dense, filled with unfamiliar legal language. He looked toward Saru.
What do you think?
Saru smiled reassuringly.
If it helps avoid family problems later, it's probably the right thing to do.
Darilla hesitated. For the first time, something inside him whispered to slow down. Then Kitsune gently pointed to one page.
No pressure. Take all the time you need. I just don't want your family facing unnecessary hardship if something unexpected happens.
The room fell quiet. Rain continued to fall. Darilla thought about his grandchildren. He thought about peace. He thought about protecting everyone after he was gone. He picked up the pen, signed, and smiled with relief. Kitsune carefully gathered the papers.
You're a thoughtful man, Darilla.
After the visitors left, Darilla stood on the porch watching them disappear into the forest. Something didn't feel right. He couldn't explain why. Back inside, the old oak tree outside creaked loudly in the wind. One small branch cracked and fell silently to the ground. Darilla looked toward the window. He didn't yet realize that the first branch to fall would not be from the tree. It would be from the family itself. Winter arrived early. The first snow settled over the forest, turning every branch white. Darilla stood outside his cabin, admiring the quiet morning. It felt peaceful. Until someone knocked. 3 firm knocks. Not a neighbor, not family. A courier owl handed him a sealed envelope. Inside was a legal notice. Dorilla frowned. There had to be some mistake. According to the document, ownership of his cabin and surrounding land had already been transferred into a family trust with new controlling provisions. His hands trembled. He read the page again, then again. The words never changed.
I never agreed to this.
His voice cracked. He rushed to Saru.
Tell me this is wrong.
Saru looked nervous.
I thought it was only paperwork.
Dorilla stared at him.
You told me it protected the family.
I believed Kitsune.
Silence. The room suddenly felt colder than the winter outside. Dorilla searched every drawer for his copy of the documents. They weren't there. His heart pounded. He remembered signing. He remembered trusting. But he couldn't remember anyone explaining what every page meant. That night, he sat alone beneath the old oak tree. Snow rested on its branches. One by one, small frozen limbs snapped under the weight. The tree was still standing, but inside, damage had already begun. The next morning, Kamei slowly walked toward the cabin carrying an old lantern. Its light was small, but steady. He found Dorilla sitting in silence.
I failed my family.
Dorilla whispered. Kamei shook his head.
No, you trusted someone who earned your confidence. Those are not the same thing.
Dorilla handed him the papers. Kamei read every page carefully. He didn't rush. He circled unfamiliar clauses with a charcoal pencil. Then he looked up.
This isn't just about one signature. It's about what you understood before you signed.
Dorilla's eyes widened. Kamei continued.
Real professionals encourage questions. They explain. They welcome a second opinion. They never make understanding feel inconvenient.
Dorilla remembered the meeting, the compliments, the urgency, the polished folders, the reassuring smiles. He realized something painful. Not once had he asked for another independent review. Not because anyone stopped him, because he believed trust was enough. Kamei gently closed the folder.
Trust is precious.
But important decisions deserve verification. The lantern flickered. Outside, fresh tracks appeared in the snow. Fox tracks leading away from the cabin. Over the following days, Dorilla began remembering details that once seemed insignificant. Kitsune always answered quickly, too quickly. Whenever Dorilla asked a difficult question, the conversation shifted back to family, back to emotions, back to fear.
What if something happens tomorrow? What if your grandchildren suffer? What if your wishes aren't honored?
Every conversation pointed away from understanding and toward urgency. Kamei gathered the family beneath the old oak tree. He held up two objects, an acorn and a glowing ember.
They're both small,
He said.
but only one can burn down a forest.
He looked around the circle.
Greed rarely arrives shouting. It whispers, it flatters, it promises peace.
Then it quietly asks you to hurry. Saru lowered his head.
I wanted to help. I thought I was protecting everyone.
Kamei nodded.
Many scams don't begin with bad people. They begin with ordinary people, repeating promises they never verified.
The family stood in silence. For the first time, they understood the difference between love and blind trust. The fire hadn't started with evil, it had started with assumptions. The following weeks were difficult. Dorilla met with qualified professionals to understand his legal options. Some problems could be challenged, others could not. The process would take time. The outcome was uncertain, but one thing changed immediately. The family changed how they made important decisions. No one signed alone. Every major document received independent review. Questions were welcomed. Pressure was treated as a warning sign. Kamei helped Dorilla create a simple family plan. Not a secret, not hidden in a drawer. Everyone knew where important documents were kept. Everyone understood Dorilla's wishes. Conversations replaced assumptions. Transparency replaced confusion. One evening, Dorilla carved a new mark into the old oak tree. Not another year worked, a different reminder. He carved one word, wisdom.
The strongest inheritance,
He said softly.
isn't money. It's making sure the people you love understand your wishes.
The wind carried the words through the forest. This time, there was no smoke. Spring returned. Fresh leaves covered the old oak tree. Some branches were gone forever, but new ones had grown. Dorilla stood beneath the tree surrounded by family, even Saru. He had spent months rebuilding trust through actions instead of promises. Not every wound had healed, some never would, but forgiveness had begun. Far away, Kitsune packed his briefcase. Another forest, another town, another family searching for certainty. Predators rarely disappear. They simply look for places where questions are never asked. Kame watched the distant trail, then turned to Dorilla.
The goal isn't to live in fear, it's to make honesty stronger than deception.
Dorilla smiled.
I thought my greatest gift would be this cabin.
He looked at his grandchildren playing beneath the oak.
I was wrong. My greatest gift is teaching them how to protect one another.
The camera slowly rose above the forest. The oak tree stood tall, scarred, weathered, still alive. Every year, older adults lose billions of dollars to fraud and financial exploitation. While the methods change, many schemes rely on the same patterns, creating urgency, building trust too quickly, discouraging independent advice, or exploiting family dynamics. If this story reminded you of someone you love, have a conversation today. Encourage them to ask questions, take their time with important decisions, and seek independent advice before signing documents or sending money. Because the strongest legacy isn't simply what we leave behind, it's the wisdom we pass on before we're gone.